This lecture is going to be over fractions. We could all use a little bit of help regarding fractions. Fractions are one of those things that if you don't do very often, then when it comes to time to actually concentrate on it, then you don't know how to do things properly. And sometimes marketing campaigns where people get confused as to whether or not a quarter pounder is actually larger than a third pounder. Thinking the public thinking that they're getting a better value for some reason, or thinking that 1/4 is greater than 1/3, and therefore decide to choose that sandwich over another. So there are reasons to have the ability to be able to do a fraction at your fingertips. That's something that's skill that you might want to hone. So it's what is a fraction? A fraction is going to be a math method of expressing a value that is less than 1. It can be used to express a ratio of two values. A fraction consists of two parts. You've got a numerator, which is the thing in the top, and the denominator, which is the thing in the bottom. The denominator is the number that the numerator is being divided by. So there are three types of fractions. You've got proper, you've got improper, and then you've got mixed numbers. So a proper fraction consists of a numerator that is smaller than a denominator. So you can see 5/6, 4/7, 23/64. All of these numerators are smaller than the denominators. An improper fraction contains a larger numerator than a denominator, and that's what you're seeing here. Mixed fractions contain an integer as well as a proper fraction. And mixed fractions and improper fractions are interchangeable. So you have a method here by which you can go through and take an improper fraction and turn it into a mixed number. So you've got 17/6, you've got the numerator larger than the denominator. So what you are doing here in order to be able to create a mixed number is to figure out how many times 6, this denominator, appears when you're adding together values that add up to 17. So if you take 6 and 6, you add those two together, you get 12. It's not quite 17. What's the remainder? You've got 5. So you've got 6 and 6 and then 5. So you've got 6/6, that's going to be defined as 1. You've got another 6/6 that's defined as 1. 1 plus 1 ends up being 2. You add a fraction to that, so you got 2 and 5/6. So this is a method of taking an improper fraction and turning it into a mixed number, which is an integer plus a proper fraction. So comparing. In order to find out which of two fractions is larger, you can use a technique called cross multiplying. So the first cross product is the multiplication of the first number with the second number. The second cross product is the multiplication of the second numerator with the first denominator. I think I said this wrong. The first cross product is the multiplication of the first numerator with the second denominator, sorry. So if the first cross product is larger than the second, then the first fraction is larger than the second. So let's take an example. You've got two fractions here are compared, and it looks like the second fraction is larger. So, is 5/8 or 11/17 the larger fraction? Well, if we cross multiply, if we take this and this, come up with 85. We take this and this, multiply that together, and we come up with 88. So another way to be able to do this is to find a least common multiple of the denominator and then multiply these two numbers together, put that over that value, and multiply these two together and put that number over that value, that same value. And essentially, that's kind of what they're doing here. They're just not really telling you that. So if you were to go through that particular process, what you would find here is that you would be putting 85 over that least common denominator. And here you'd be putting 88 over that least common denominator. that would mean that this particular fraction would be greater than this one. So in order to add fractions, you got to have several rules about what format they can be. You first have to take mixed fractions and convert them to improper fractions before they can be added. Second, fractions can only be added if they have a common denominator. In order to add the fractions with different denominators, it's necessary to convert them so that they have the same denominator, which is exactly what I was talking about earlier. So the first method to do that is the method of lowest common denominator. This method simply involves making a list of the multiples of each denominator and finding the lowest number common to both lists, and that's going to be the LCD. So we'll go through that. Once you find that, the multiple needs to convert each denominator to the LCD. The multiple needed to convert each denominator to the LCD is determined, and both the numerator and denominator of each fraction is multiplied by that number. So let's say you want to add 3/5 to 7/12. What you're going to do here is you're going to take 5, and they've spelled out several different multiples of 5, and you end up coming up with 60. 12 here, they take 12 and they multiply it out, and they come up with 60. This is the first number in each series that appears in both lists. Therefore, your least common denominator is going to end up being 60. So in each of these cases, you've got to figure out what it's going to take, what you have to multiply 5 by in order to produce 60. And as it turns out, that happens to be 12. 12 here, in order to produce 60, you have to multiply that by 5. So that's where you get these 60s from. Now, if you're going to multiply the bottom by a number, you have to do the same thing to the top. So that's where this 12 comes from here. So you've got 3 times 12, that ends up being 36. Over here, since you're multiplying by 5, you have to multiply the 7 by the 5, and you end up with 35. When you put them both together, you end up with 71 over 60. Now that's going to be an improper fraction. How do you change that? You're going to have to change that because you've got 71 up here. That's the same as 60 plus 11. So you would have 60 over 60 plus 11 over 60, so that 60 over 60 becomes 1. Add it together, and that's where it comes from. Over here, you have 3/4 plus 1/10. So when you start with the first denominator here and you start multiplying out all of the multiples, you come up with 20. Do the same thing here with 10. Multiplying those out, you come up with 20. 20 is going to be the first number here that is in common with both sets of values. Because of that, you end up making 20 the least common denominator of each fraction. So you have to figure out what you have to multiply 4 by in order to produce 20. As it turns out, that ends up being 5. Same thing up at the top. You have to multiply that by 5. So 3/4 becomes 15 over 20. Over here, you've got 20 at the bottom. You got 10 over here, so you need to figure out what to multiply 10 by in order to produce 20. As it turns out, that's 2. Same thing in the top. Take 1, multiply it by 2, and you end up with 2 in the top. Adding the two numerators together, which you can do for fractions that share the same denominator, you end up with 15 plus 2 over 20. That's 17 over 20. So that's the least common denominator method. Now, the second method is going to involve simply multiplying the denominator of the second fraction by both the numerator and the denominator of the first, and then multiplying the denominator of the first fraction by both the numerator and denominator of the second fraction. And then the numerators are added as just like the first method. In many cases, the resulting fraction is not in its lowest terms and will need to be reduced. So we've got 3/4 plus 1/10. So we take those two numbers and multiply them together, we end up with 40. So when we take this value, we change it to 40. We take that value and also change it to 40. And when we do that, that means we're taking this 4 and multiplying it by 10 in order to produce the 40. Well, you can't just do that and keep the fraction the same. You have to change what's in the top here too. You have to change that to being whatever that is in the numerator, which in this case is 3, and multiply it by that same value, 10. So 3/4 ends up becoming 30 over 40. Over here, you're taking the 10, you're multiplying it by 4 in order to produce the 40. Since you have a 1 in the numerator, you multiply that by that same factor. So you end up with 4. So you've got 30 plus 4, with each of those denominators being 40. And you end up with 34 over 40. That can be reduced because both numbers are even. Because of that, you factor out a 2 out of both, and it ends up being 17 over 20. So you do end up with some issues here, that not being the most reduced form of the fraction. So you have to watch out for that kind of thing to see if there are any common factors there. This method still works. It's just that's one extra thing that you have to worry about. So if the fractions to be added are mixed fractions, then the fractions need to be converted to improper fractions, just like they're stated above. And then when adding a fraction to a whole number, the whole number is treated as a mixed fraction and needs to be converted into an improper fraction. So here you got 3/7 plus 5 and 4/7. So what we're going to do is we're going to strip that 5 away. So we got 3/7 plus 5 times 7 over 7, because technically it's 5. And you have 7 over 7 here. So that number, if you technically went through and canceled those out, it would end up being a 5. So when you add all of that together, you end up with 42 over 7, which ends up equaling 6. So subtracting fractions is just like adding fractions. The denominators of all the fractions must be the same. The only difference is that the numerators are subtracted rather than being added. Now, if you're multiplying fractions, it doesn't require that the fractions have the same denominator. So instead, the numerators are multiplied and the denominators are multiplied. But again, your result may not be in lowest terms, so you would have to go through and check to see if there's anything in common with both the numerator and the denominator. So if you're going to multiply 7/9 by 3/4, you end up with 7 times 3, which is going to be 21, 9 times 4, which is going to be 36. You find out that 21 and 36 share a common factor of 3. So you factor out a 3 out of both, and you end up with 7 over 12. It is possible that you can go through and that you can reduce before you multiply. In this particular case, what you could do is you could take that 9 and turn it into a 3 times 3, cancel those 3's out to begin with, and then you would end up with far less to have to worry about. Same kind of thing would happen here, is that you have 12 times 5 times 5, 25 times 16 times 9. You can go through and break those down to their prime factors, see what cancels, and then you can produce your final answer. Again, you're going to need to have proper or improper fractions, or the fractions need to be proper whenever you get your final result. If you're dividing fractions, there's a very key thing that you need to remember here. We don't really necessarily have fractions or a method so much for division as we do changing it into being able to use multiplication. And so here's how we go about doing that. If we want to take 6/7 and divide it by 2/3, rather than try to find a way to divide by 2/3, we take the reciprocal of that and do multiplication. So we end up with 6 times 3, which is 18, 7 times 2, which is 14. So rather than divide by 2/3, we take the reciprocal of the denominator here and then do multiplication. That's what we end up with. We can do the same type of thing here where we've got 4/7 divided by 2/3 divided by 9 over 13. As we work through this from left to right, rather than take division by 2/3, we multiply by 3/2. We come up with 6 over 7. We then take that result, 6 over 7, and divide by 9 over 13, which means we flip it over to 13 over 9. Go through the multiplication, we find out we have 78 over 63. We then reduce that, it becomes 26 over 21. Obviously, it's an improper fraction. This is the same as 21 plus 5, so we take out a 1 and have 5 over 21 left. So that's a simple review of fractions. If you need more help with it, I can certainly provide that.